Good evening. We have here Les Adler, professor of history in the Hutchins Department. You gave a lecture and your subject was on the abandonment of the Jews that they received during the war. How does this tie into the series at Sonoma State University?
In an interesting way, I think people have focused on the actual killing and the actual burnings and the terrible things that were done in Germany during the war. And that certainly happened and was terrible. But I think that's excluded a look at perhaps one very significant area, which is the way the rest of the world responded or didn't respond to what was going on there. You can ask the question, why didn't this get prevented? How could this have happened? How could other civilized people in the world let things reach this point? It wasn't just the Germans. Why did this happen? So that's really why I've approached it, because there was a much larger world on the outside which I believe could have done certain things to prevent the abandonment of the Jews or the destruction of the Jews, and they didn't. I think the only fair term is one of abandonment. And it also seems to me very important that we take the Holocaust as something that happened in the past, but isn't only to the past, because we are now existing in a world where similar kinds of things do happen or can happen, and I think we're faced with the same problem. The issue, the Jews who were killed in Germany during the war are dead and gone, but there are millions and millions of other people living who perhaps are in danger of these kinds of things happening in their countries, and if the rest of the world isn't to exert itself to stop it, then perhaps we are doing the same kind of abandonment. And it seems to me particularly important in a course on the Holocaust that its current relevance be brought to people's attention, that we become aware and that we stay aware and search out, when necessary, the information we need to find out how to prevent this and what we can do individually. I think it helps also to overcome the feeling that I hear from a lot of students about feeling powerless, about feeling, I don't know what to do in the world. There's so many things wrong. There's so many things going on. Part of that is not having a focus and not being able to find a way to act. And I think taking responsibility for the conditions of people throughout the world is one way of plugging in, of finding a way to act.
And why are you teaching in this Holocaust for yourself?
Well, for myself, the Holocaust is an issue that played a part in my childhood, in my background. My parents escaped from Europe before the Holocaust, so they weren't caught up in it, but other parts of my family were lost. And as I grew up, after World War II, one thing that my family was engaged in was helping the displaced person, the survivors from Europe who came to the United States or who were allowed in, find a way of rebuilding their lives and making a new life in this world here. So it's been part of my whole life. And then as a historian, one of the areas of my background is in Jewish history. So I've looked at the whole pattern from a historical, kind of an objective viewpoint, as well as from a feeling, family experience viewpoint. And to me, the Holocaust course is one of the most important things that's been done on the campus. That we need, people need not to forget the Holocaust. It needs to be brought to people's attention. It should be part of curriculum in high schools and all over the world. We've tended to go on the impression that, well, we should make the Germans teach about this in their schools, so they won't do it again. Well, I don't think the problem is with the Germans. I don't think they're in a position to ever do this again. The problem is with the rest of the world, where there are mini Holocaust, destruction of lives going on by governments in some organized fashion, and that's why I want to teach about this and keep people aware of it.
Thank you for that. And you're teaching a subject that is very difficult for people to understand, especially the younger people, and I want to know why you think this is.
Because it's inconceivable. I think it was for the people who were living both in Germany and then the rest of the world. part of the reason that the Holocaust happened was that people couldn't conceive that it could happen. It was beyond the bounds of human ability to really imagine that anybody would do this to anybody else, that any group of people would actually go and seek to exterminate another group. And I think we face the same kind of incredulity. How can people do this? What is it in the human being that can allow this to happen? Us in our daily lives, think of ourselves as good people. We live our lives, we help people, we're good Samaritans of one sort or another. And we can't imagine our friends or the people we know or even the people we don't like or even the Republicans or the Democrats or people that are on the other side of some issue that we've got in this country doing anything like this. It's inhuman. It's beyond human capacity. So we don't want to think about it. And there's nothing driving us to think about it unless it's brought to our immediate attention. So this is a way of bringing it to our attention and saying, you know, like a slap in the face, wake up. You know,
they need it.
This can't happen. We all need it.
Why do you think the Jews were abandoned from everybody?
Well, it's different in different parts of the world. This is one of the curiosities of it. For one thing, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism that was not just in Germany. Pardon me. Anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, in all the countries of Europe. Jews were a minority group. They had been one of the least digestible of the groups of people living in Europe for 1,000 years. They were the only ones who wouldn't become Christian, who weren't like everybody else in some way. They insisted on holding on to their perspective and their religion. And this put them at odds with the societies. And there's a curious phenomenon that whenever things get hard in a society, whenever there's something like an economic depression, or there is a war, or something that makes people fearful, they turn on some scapegoat. They're anxious to find somebody to blame it on. Who can we blame our problems on? And the worldwide depression of the 30s was one factor in setting this whole thing up. It made it possible first for a character like Hitler to come to power, and then for the society to turn and focus, as Hitler was doing, on a specific group he identified as the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they were disposable people, the Jews?
They were disposable in the sense that nobody cared enough or felt it was their place enough to step in on their behalf.
Scapegoats.
Hitler did not start out to murder the Jews. The curious thing, and I think most people don't realize this, when Hitler came to power in 1933, all the way up through 1941, his goal was to get the Jews out of Germany. He didn't want the Jews there. He tried to force them to migrate, to go anywhere. And the real problem comes from the fact that nobody would take them, that they had no place to go. And that is where the true horror of the situation comes back to us. If you think about being Germany and trying to get out and realizing that your country hates you, that you are disposable, or that they're trying to take everything away from you, and you're willing to go, but all these good people out in the rest of the world, all these democracies won't take you. I mean, the frustration is incredible. So in some indirect way, I think you can blame the rest of the world for allowing it to happen. Hitler didn't set out to do this. His final solution, which the Germans decided on in 1940-41, essentially was a response to the fact that nobody else wanted the Jews, and as Germany expanded, they took over larger and larger areas with more and more Jews, and finally they reached the point where they were just going to destroy them. And even at that point, even when the West learned of the destruction, learned of the existing camps and the organized massacre of millions of innocent people, even then the West, the civilized, quote, civilized countries of the world didn't do anything about it, or did the minimal part. So in answer to your question, yeah, the Jews were disposable because they were not popular, because they didn't have any political power in any of the democratic countries. England or the United States, the two countries that could have done something, that could have used their leverage, their power in the world's empire, America with its abundance of land and wealth, could have done something to take in thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews, save them, but they didn't. And the Jews weren't important politically, so there was no real organized pressure on the government in the United States or in Britain to open the doors to Jewish immigration. And the rest of the world was preoccupied. America was in the midst of a depression, People were worried about jobs. Why should we let in all these poor people who are just going to increase our unemployment rate? And all the way along, people look at it in the short range, and they refuse to see the ultimate issues that are at stake.
That ties in with my last questions that I have. It's a bit of an expert, so I'm going to, read it to you. At the height of the extermination in 1943 and 44, there was a lot of evidence in the form of pictures of the gas chambers and exterminations from the survivors who escaped Auschwitz. This evidence was presented by the Jewish leadership to the Allies, pleading for them to bod the rail lines to Auschwitz, yet they refused to do it. The excuse was that the war effort had top priority and they did not have the planes to do the job. But the factories around Auschwitz were being bombed a mere 2 miles away. And how long would it take for a plane to go over another 2 miles? Why do you think it was done?
Well, there are bureaucratic reasons for it that people have given. There are reasons that people have said, well, it was just pure anti-Semitism in the military. They didn't want to waste their bombs on saving Jews. I think it's deeper than that. I think that it has to do with the total sense of abandonment and the limited scope that the world was willing to use in looking at this question. People still, even though they knew and learned of the existence of death camps, our governments knew of that in 1942, starting in August and September, and of the extermination methods. At that point, all the Allied governments refused to put the Jews as a special category. They were still, in my mind, refusing to recognize the reality of this situation. They had the information. They knew that it did, but it didn't intrude on their consciousness, I think, to the point where they could recognize that this was something beyond ordinary, out of extraordinary, out of any realm of historical possibility, and that they needed to do extraordinary things in order to save the Jews. They refused to take that step in their own minds. It would have taken an extraordinary step to say, let's make the saving of the Jews one of the focuses of the war. Instead, when the Jews went to the governments and said, look, all you have to do to save thousands or millions of people is bomb the rail lines, bomb the crematoria. Surely you can afford a few more bombs or a few bombers on those kinds of raids. The answer the Jews always got back was, the war effort, winning the war against Germany, is what is our prime effort. We're going to save our bombs for military targets or for industrial targets that will stop German war production and do those kinds of actions. And that's for the Jews, so you should go home and leave it in our hands. And the Jews had no answer to that, and they couldn't in some way. They could scream as loud as they wanted, but the fact is they weren't important enough to sway these enormous bureaucracies, which are military and governmental, to take this kind of action. It's curious. One of the curiosities is that Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the war, ordered the British Air Force at one point to this kind of an action, this kind of a bombing. And despite his enormous power and prestige during the war, they never carried it out. The order was blocked at various ways, and they set up study commissions to see if this was feasible. And Churchill had a million things on his mind to do during the war, but he himself seems to have been sensitive enough to the issue to want to do something. Roosevelt was not, by the way, but Churchill was. And yet, in the midst of this gigantic war effort with millions of people doing millions of things, the actions were never taken. Where down the line, somebody else decided not to take the action, not to do it, and to study it a little more, and then some generals or admirals or various people decided they couldn't use the resources that way. And by the time that the decisions got delayed and everything else, it didn't make any difference. The Jews continued to be destroyed. It's one of the saddest chapters in world history, and from my perspective, not just because of what the Germans were doing, but because of what we refused to do. Yeah. So my conclusion on the whole thing is that that's why we've got to pay attention to it, so that we don't blind ourselves again.
Thank you very much, Professor Adler.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's helped me a lot.
Prisoners and the damage that they did, and how passive the Jewish were in some cases, but they were oppressed, and the American prisoners were soldiers, and they were trained, and we kind of put it in perspective a little bit. And we talked about the air crews and why they didn't blow up the railroad tracks to the camps. And in my experience with Germany, I spent some time over there and went to Anne Frank's house, which was very emotional. A lot of the letters that she had wrote and things were on the walls, and some of the history. And she died several days before they had overran one of the camps, and the Americans really didn't know what was going on. And then they fed the refugees food that they had, and of course they were starving, so the food gassed up in them and it actually killed them. So then the Americans really just killed a lot of the refugees, not knowing it at the time.
All right. Is anything else out of that group, Fred?
Partly we kind of just discussed that there might have been additional perspectives that weren't necessarily really looked at for a couple of reasons. This is that there might have been people taking the course who felt hesitant to view their personal feelings because they felt like the course was so centered on the Jewish aspect of the Holocaust, and that a lot of people might have felt that they would have offended people if they'd have voiced these, you might have been oppositional in a sense, or appeared that way. That was one concern.
Now understand what we're doing. We're not interacting regarding the questions at this point. You've discussed, so we're getting a report. You might say we want to get a report of what your experience has been, and then we'll do some interacting. How about this group? What happened here?
We had sort of like 3 points. Our first sense of feeling was that of frustration. Frustration that we've here on Earth, our different ages for so long, and we've had years of education, and we still didn't have a sense of what the Holocaust was, what the real impact was, what the exile and annihilation of people, the genocide. We didn't have a sense of that, and there was a frustration that we didn't get that with our years and with our education. Another point was, on a feeling level, was what was the experience of fear of people who, we are people, and people did this, and we are people, and could we do this, and the turmoil inside of that question of how would we respond if our children were at risk, or not just ourselves, but our loved ones. And the third area was that all 3 of us agreed that we felt stronger in the sense that we had more courage. We would stand up, and we would become more conscious and more outspoken about discrimination of any kind.
Any other reports from that group?
No, I think she covered it.
All right. How about this?
A number of things. One thing that was interesting to us was the various reasons that we took the course to begin with, and then how things that we learn.
Why, and I realized that how people were brainwashed to the degree that they let this happen, and how we could somehow avoid it.